Hello there, and welcome to the Thank You Fellows podcast. My name is Caleb, and I'm joined by Doctors Rod Rosenblatt, Adam Francisco, and Scott Keith. This is our first episode after being back from Here We Still Stand. So we recorded a couple episodes of Here We Still Stand, the live show, which has been out for a couple weeks now, and then we recorded 2 more episodes sort of in a back room while we were there with various guests that we wouldn't usually have an opportunity to get on the show. But we're back to our normal hosts this week in our normal system. It's not as exciting as being in front of the live crowd. That's a fun episode, but it's definitely different being on a panel. This was the same case in Norway because we don't always take pictures of the studio, but we all face each other around a table here during normal conversation, and so you can sort of look around and see if the next person's going to talk or something like that. And when you're on those panel discussions, you cannot see each other really unless you bend over the table and you look. So you kind of have to pray that somebody's going to answer the next question or tell a story or something like that. And both times it's gone fairly well. And it's just different, and it's nice and comfortable to be back in the studio, at least for me. Yeah. I don't know if you guys feel the same, but it's definitely a different format when you have like the strict panel questions.
Yeah, I'm just still tired from Here We Still Stand.
Yeah. It's like that one time a year. It's exhausting, but it's also, you try to do as much as you can because there's just so many people you don't get to see or talk to regularly. And that's, outside of the talks, that's my favorite part of it, honestly, is just the people I get to spend time with who I don't get to spend time with regularly in the year.
And how many denominations are represented? Way beyond us.
Several, yeah. There's only about 100 tickets left for next year if people want to sign up.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So that's a much faster sellout rate than last year. Yeah. So if you're thinking about it, I guess that means now is the time to buy tickets. I'll put the link in the show notes for registration. Like I said, the talks are great. I think it's worth it to come for the talks, but the fellowship, it sounds sort of cheesy, but is better, is the best part of the conference, at least for me, and I think it is for a lot of people. It becomes worth the trip. It is sort of like a vacation. It's
nice.
It's at a nice setting, a nice hotel, and it's definitely different than your sort of academic theological conferences, that's for sure. And I don't know, I think I have a good time. I suggest if you haven't been to Here We Still Stand, that is, I would start thinking about it now because it might take some planning, especially if you don't live locally in California. You got to buy plane tickets, you got to book a hotel room, all those sorts of things. So you might have to
step one is get your ticket.
Yeah, might have to schedule in-laws to watch kiddos or something like that. But I do think you should consider it. So moving on to today's episode, I want to talk about something I think we've talked a lot about recently, but I want to go from a different approach. I want to talk about the importance of historical methodology and why is it not only important to Christianity, which I think we should get around to in this episode because it is, but in general, why is it important? What is it? Are there various methodologies? Is there any debate over what methodology is the right one to use? And how does it relate to people sort of in everyday life? That's sort of a general way of throwing it out there. But maybe, Adam, you could start by just explaining or what is a historical methodology?
Yeah, we got an in-house expert.
Well, I don't know if
I don't think you're talking about Adam.
It depends what you're wanting to do, in your history. But generally speaking, in describing the past, you work inductively from pieces of evidence, mostly primary source texts. Nowadays, depending on what you're looking at, sometimes that includes archaeological evidence and so on and so forth. You put all those pieces of evidence and you reason to the best explanation or you write your narrative, you describe the past such that it accounts for all that evidence without leaving stuff out or assuming certain things to be true that aren't necessarily there. I mean, that's the gold standard. You could say that historians work with a correspondence theory of truth. A coherent narrative is certainly nice.
Sure.
But the real measure of a good description of the past is whether your description actually links up to or corresponds to the evidence that we have.
Yeah.
So that means there may be gaps or things like that if something
Sure.
wasn't recorded, right?
Sure.
And so you have to be careful about sort of inferring or filling those in, or if you do, sort of letting people know where the evidence stops and where sort of your narrative begins.
Yeah, the other thing that I noticed in the study of it, that there's a whole gang of people who say, now, of course, anything miraculous you can't introduce.
Right.
It's an a priori.
Yeah.
This, of course, we don't cover that sort of thing, as if it's religious or something.
Yeah, I would suggest that the best historians are out there are the ones who don't assume certain metaphysical
Right.
things, to use an accurate term. No,
Right.
Don't, don't
Right.
assume that just because in their lifetime they haven't observed something supernatural, if you will, that
Yep.
that doesn't mean there isn't a supernatural. Those things are to be avoided. We at the University of Oxford, I had to take a course in what's called historiography, which is kind of the methodology
Yep.
of writing down history, and we were reading the Venerable Bede,
Yeah.
his history of the church and among the English-speaking peoples, and I think he's 8th century. Lived in Northumbria, northeastern England. I don't think he ever left the village
He lived in.
but had
Kant.
access
Like
to an
Kant.
outstanding library, and he's still in many ways kind of for medieval historiography, the gold standard. And in the seminar on Bede, one of the questions that was proposed or asked by the tutor, a guy named Henry Meyer Harding, who was, I believe, a Queen-appointed professor of church history.
Okay.
So he's no slouch. And we're in his office space. He's got medieval tapestries hanging from the walls, and it's very
Oxfordian.
it's like what you might imagine goes on at
Yeah.
in a tutor's office at Oxford. But he asked us what we all made of the miraculous in Bede's account of the history, and I didn't answer, but one of my peers was quick to answer and said, "Oh, he's medieval. Their worldview is filled with the supernatural, so of course they're gullible and they believe all these events can be described or explained by appealing to supernatural causes and so on and so forth."
Uh-huh.
And this pretty serious, sophisticated historian looked at him and said, "You're such a modernist." He says, "What makes you think you can rule out a miracle?
Oh, that's awesome.
You're a historian. You're supposed to go with the evidence."
That's awesome.
So even at places like Oxford, the real serious critical historians can sniff out somebody who smuggles in a metaphysical dogma like miracles don't happen, like
Yep.
the resurrection.
Yep.
And they'll call their colleagues out on it.
Oh, that's that's good to know, huh?
Yeah, encouraging.
I mean, I'm not saying there's a whole lot of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
There are some.
Of course.
Well, it seems, that's important to sort of the outside inquiry towards religious study, even then. I mean, it sort of stops even Christians from ruling out other religions just offhand.
Right.
All right.
So I run into this a lot with regard to Islam. Because in the
Sure.
biography of Muhammad, there's lots of accounts of miracles.
Isn't the major one the one about the moon coming in and
Yeah.
passing through both these sleeves, but it was so fast that nobody could see it?
Well, nobody was around to see it even.
Okay.
So, Muhammad looks at the night sky and he's looking for a kind of confirmation of his so-called prophethood, and the moon falls in half, or gets split in half. Half of it falls out of the sky, goes in one sleeve around his back and out the other. Other great miracles when he was born.
It's an odd miracle. Like, what's the point?
Yeah,
of
yeah.
the moon splitting in half
Well,
and going through his sleeves.
To confirm in Muhammad's mind that he was a prophet, because he wrestled with that for the first 2 or 3 years of his so-called call to prophethood. But another one, when he was born, his mother Amina, as he's coming out of the birth canal, a light also comes out and illuminates the whole globe.
Oh,
You get these things like that, and in the context, if I'm speaking with Muslims, they will be very quick to point out that I hold Islam to a different standard than Christianity. And my response is something like what you said, Scott. I said, well, I'm not saying these miracles didn't happen, but if there's nobody around to see them, and if they don't really speak to any sort of human need or anything like that, they're kind of inconsequential. So whether they happen or not, who cares?
Well, the miracles in Christianity seem to be history altering in almost every right. So even the miracles of Jesus healing people, that alters some sort of thing in permanent space and time. It's not a miracle that happens and then it ends, like the moon coming down and then going back up right to where it was. It actually alters something permanently.
Yeah. There are critical Muslim scholars, we don't need to beat the Islamic drum here, but who make the point that those miraculous accounts were actually written into the biography as apologetic devices. Because when Islam starts to gain momentum, they're rubbing up against Jews and Christians who are asking, well, why should we believe you if there's no miracles?
Yep.
And so they put them in there. But you can't rule out the supernatural claims in other religions. That's
right. Right.
But the interesting thing is, if you look at other religions and these supernatural claims, unlike Christianity, where there's archaeological evidence, there's so much overwhelming evidence for this. Other religions, they're just claims somebody made in the past, and that's as far as it goes.
They're just assertions.
Yeah. There's not an eyewitness tradition. It doesn't change or affect history the way it does with Christianity. So you got to be open to them. That doesn't mean you need to take them seriously.
Yep.
So in removed from religion, is it important that we know that certain things or certain people actually existed if the ideas are still present? So is it important that we know that Plato was a real person if the ideas which are attributed to him are, relevant?
Well, it'd be upsetting if he wasn't a real person, but the ideas would still live. And that's the difference. Again, and we talk quite a bit about this on the show. The difference with Christianity is it all falls apart.
Yep.
If certain things didn't happen.
Well, if certain assertions are not true, it falls apart.
Yeah. In 1 Corinthians 15, if you can show that his bones are in some tomb, Christianity falls.
So I guess unlike a philosophy, Christianity doesn't matter if that writer was the actual writer. Because with philosophy, it's those ideas exist and have now been interpreted and passed down, but Christianity is more than the sum of its ideas. It's actually contingent on something happening or existing.
It can be factually overthrown. And you ask somebody from another religion, is there any factual state of affairs which, if it actually prevailed, would cause you to change religions? And many will instantly say no. And unfortunately, some Christians answer that when they're pressed in a philosophy class. Is there anything that would cause you not to believe in Jesus?
Or in a televised public debate.
Yeah, that one you always feel bad for because it seems like the heart was in the right place, right?
Yep.
He's
trying
see
to do the right thing. He just got caught.
Yeah, he's trying to make it so other Christians don't doubt,
conundrum.
Right? And that's a hard position to be in, but. We talk about that debate a lot. It might be worth it. I've never put it in the show notes before. It might be worth it to put in the show notes so people could see an example of apologetics done apart from this historical methodology, I guess. Because that one's actually pretty fair. It was a public debate, and there it is. We didn't reference it directly, but for those who don't know, this was Bill Nye, the science guy, and Ken Ham,
the creationist, essentially
from the creation. The Creation Institute is who he
answers in Genesis.
And they sort of had a very a televised debate. It's interesting because Bill Nye is not a real science guy,
right?
He plays one on TV, but when you have
is that true? Is that
yes, it is true.
I didn't know that was true.
So when you have writers and money and staff, though, you can prepare for a debate. You don't have to be a science guy to have a debate about science. And it's an interesting. It's long. It's like almost 2 hours or something like that. It's long, but at the very end, Bill Nye gets Ken Ham essentially. Is there any factual state of affairs that would cause you to
there it is.
Be in disbelief?
Yep.
And he just plainly says, no, there's nothing that'll change my mind.
Yep.
Which even in a debate setting is that's admitting that you're not even there to debate, you're there to evangelize. essentially. That the ideas weren't even up for discussion in the first place.
And it betrays not really an understanding of even the New Testament text. 1 Corinthians 15 is an extended argument, particularly about Jesus' resurrection. And Paul says, if this did not happen, we are of all men most to be pitied. We're worshiping something that's false.
I do want to point out, though, that I don't think that sort of mentality is unique to Christianity or religion, even. I mean, I've seen this with historical events where, like, somebody questions maybe the preciseness of our recording of some battle in the past or something like that, but it's then announced to be universal fact, well known, or something like that. That's the same thing. Is there anything that could make you believe that the Napoleonic Wars didn't happen?
Yeah.
If you say no to that,
Yep.
you're not doing honest history, are you?
Yep.
Adam, you said at the outset that doing history is an inductive method. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, we could get a little more technical. It's actually more abductive, but just we're looking at individual pieces of evidence, or you look at individual pieces of evidence and you infer to the best explanation for all that evidence, rather than the deductive approach, where you assume something to be true in the first place, and then you look at all the facts and you put all the facts into this kind of almost Procrustean bed and describe whatever it is you're looking at that way.
It's fine in math.
That's where it works,
Yeah.
math and that almost perfect science, geometry.
Yeah.
It is, in fact, perfect, I think. Plato thought so. So, yeah, I mean, that's the big difference. Historians don't assume something to be true in the first place and then go look at evidence.
Yeah.
If you're doing, like, history from the ground up.
Yeah.
You mentioned the Napoleonic Wars, or
I just tried to throw out some example
that's
there.
pretty recent, and there's no reason to think that they didn't happen.
But
why
I think
they
in past episodes we've said there's doubt about things like landing on the moon. The details of 9/11. I mean, as recent as
Sure.
is in the 2000s is doubted or at least joked about as.
Well,
being
so it's the
doubted by some people.
explanation of those events. It's nobody denies that the
Correct.
two towers
It's
fell.
the
and it's
cause.
like, the cause of all that. So
Well, especially in the case of 9/11.
Yeah.
I've used this before, but I think it's worth repeating. When I was in doctoral work in philosophy at USC, somebody came in and interrupted Dallas Willard's lecture. You don't do that unless it's your wife was killed in a car accident. You don't do it. So when the guy left, Dr. Willard looked at all of us and said, okay, let's stop this lecture. The flat earthers are outside. See if any of you can make any traction against them. The ones who are defending that the earth is like a plate, not like an orange.
Caleb's a flat earther.
No, I'm not.
you mentioned mentioning Napoleon again. There is this interesting fellow in the 19th century named Richard Whatley, who was a Christian apologist. Craig Parton's written a biography and also included the text of one of his more famous apologetic works in there called Historic Doubts Relative to Napoleon Bonaparte.
Yep.
Oh.
And what he does in that work shows, because this is the age of higher criticism, right? He takes the method and assumptions of higher criticism that was used to discredit the biblical text or the historicity of the biblical text and applies it to all the literature available for Napoleon Bonaparte from both the British and the French side, and concludes, just following their basic methodology, that maybe Napoleon didn't exist. The problem was he was writing at the time when Napoleon was still alive. But it was just that you had bias on the British were anti-Napoleon, the French were pro-Napoleon. And so you really couldn't trust anything, and so on and so forth.
Good illustration.
When I first brought that up, you said, well, that's pretty recent history. Is there a distinction in the trustworthiness of something that is recent versus something that is ancient? And how does one make sort of a deciding line? What is the line there?
I guess there's kind of two lines. One is you want to have, for like a professional historian, you want some historical distance and not just in terms of a timeline, but also in terms of
Influence.
emotional effect and so on, between your subject and yourself. Whatever, and that's different for every person. But the basically the rule is the further back you go, the harder and the less you know about
Isn't
things.
that
A lot more
true mostly because of the availability of text to study?
Yeah. So let's think. If you look at the history of the Roman emperors, the first in the first century, let's say, you've got basically two pretty solid Roman historians accounting for those Roman emperors, Suetonius and Tacitus, and they're writing early 2nd century. Several decades, but not too long after the New Testament authors. Nobody really questions whether Suetonius or Tacitus, whether the material we have from them has been reliably transmitted, and that whether it's there are things that people squabble about, but the general narrative people agree to. The interesting thing is we have less than 200 manuscripts of Tacitus and Suetonius, and the time span between when they actually wrote the first autograph, the first manuscript, to when we actually have manuscripts is at least 800 years. And that's the way it goes with most ancient figures and events and texts, but it's very different with the biblical tradition.
But that's
extremely different.
That's why it makes it harder with older events. And
so over that 800 years, we have a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of however many times it was re-recorded.
Well, so they're writing in the second decade of the first.
No, it's even worse than that.
Yeah.
You don't have a copy that you can date until 800 years after they supposedly wrote it. It's not like you have this bridge of copies.
That's how you got the text.
200
people copying it, but those intermediate manuscripts have all gone missing.
Yeah.
It's hard to preserve a manuscript, especially in kind of humid Europe.
So there are,
Europe
and so then there are things that could have been changed, might have been changed.
To be sure, if you look at the New Testament, we have an overwhelming amount of evidence that what we have, what's in your translation, your good one-for-one translation, like the NASB or ESV or what have you, and I'm going to debate these little finer points, but it's an accurate reflection of what the New Testament authors originally wrote. Then we've got a whole bunch of Greek and Coptic and Latin and a whole bunch of other translations of manuscripts, up to almost 30,000 of them.
Yeah.
And the time frame between when they were originally written and when we have the earliest manuscripts, it's not a settled issue, but it's less than a century.
Yep.
There's nothing like that in the ancient world.
That's right. There's nothing like that in the ancient world. If you're skeptical of the New Testament text, you ought to be really skeptical of the writings of the ancients.
Yeah, you should throw away your knowledge of the ancient world, basically.
Yeah.
Plato and Aristotle.
Yeah.
Well, and you can't trust the historical
Cicero,
narrative that you learned in school about Rome or Greece or what those events actually played out to be.
Now, we should add that just because you've been taught a certain historical narrative about Rome or the Middle Ages or whatever, it doesn't necessarily mean that's right. I mean, one of the whole points of the historian's profession is looking at the narratives we have to see if they missed something or if there was bias there, and so history is it's not always changing. The past doesn't change,
It's
but
an
our
empirical endeavor.
Yeah, it's always, we're always, at least the gold standard is, we're always trying to get closer and closer to everything we've got from the past. So sometimes there's new discoveries.
Yep.
Sometimes
That's
manuscripts.
what PhD theses are about.
Exactly, that's exactly what they're about. I mean, you get now the big trend in real history in universities is people combing through archives.
Well, and
looking at baptismal registries, drudgery type work.
Yeah.
Just seeing, doing, looking at the rates, how many children were baptized in 1492.
10 years ago, it was people just trudging their way through correspondence. Instead of reading
letters,
published works, you're just combing through an individual's letters to the various people through.
Yeah.
It'd be like somebody 500 years from now looking through your email archive.
Right.
And trying to get a picture of who you are.
Right.
Could you imagine
This
that?
person was a consumer, is what you would.
Yeah, I mean that's what it was, and I've heard now too. It's like we would call them public records type of thing.
Yeah.
Even when I was back in college, just going to the University of Washington, everybody knew, or should have known, that if you get into the history department, there are a whole bunch of Marxists who have made a metaphysical judgment over everything.
Yeah.
If you found one who wasn't operating from a prioris of Marxism, you would have found a rare treasure. And that was back, 50, 70 years ago.
Now it's in all the humanities. It's infected all the humanities and other departments. I mean, that's unfortunately. But there are those who fight the good fight and resist that. But again, it is like a diamond in the rough when you find one. When you find a person like me.
Well,
Sorry. This was happening once we let him talk this much.
I've gone to historians because I'm desperate to fill in an accurate record of U.S. history.
Mm-hmm.
And anything that is different from what all our kids have to read by Zinn. I finally sort of settled on the Brit Johnson.
Yeah, Paul Johnson.
Paul Johnson. I'll try that.
Yeah, he's excellent.
To get an accurate picture of American history.
Yeah, and so, I mean, speaking of American history, I mean, if you go to Barnes and Noble or whatever, you're going to see hundreds and hundreds of texts. I
Labeled
presume
history.
A history of America, and they're all going to. I mean, because it's such a massive. We're talking over 200 years, right?
Sure.
They're going to. Historians will always decide kind of how they're going to approach history. Are they going to approach it through the history of ideas or social history, the history of institutions, economic history, military history, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, it's a complicated thing, and it gets even more complicated when you consider, well, what sources do you use? Because you mentioned, Scott, a bit ago, there's published sources, then there's like personal correspondence, there's archives. In American history, there's this great... we use this reader at Concordia University that has mostly published works, but every once in a while we'll throw in like a diary entry or something, which helps fill in our knowledge of the everyday life.
Anything that you might have an opinion about, because when I'm doing this, I'm usually trying to discern what somebody taught, right? So what did Luther teach on X? What did Melanchthon teach on X? Mm-hmm. And the sort of the low-hanging fruit is to find if they ever addressed said topic in their published works.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right. Next step is to see, like, are there any unpublished manuscripts where they talked about X here? But then all you're really doing is seeing the stuff that they threw out, right? That they maybe said it, but it obviously didn't
make it to publish.
Make it to publishing. They didn't think it was good enough to make it to publishing. And now where you start looking at their correspondence, and I think there's a danger to some of this. That you end up getting what people thought as they were working on an idea.
Yeah, like conversations we have might not, if we were talking about a book or an episode before it goes live, some things, get scrapped before they make it on air. Mm-hmm.
And somebody might say, though, you're going to get what they really thought if you can get what they wrote to their best friend in a letter. And you're like, well, you might get what they were really spitballing if they get what they wrote to their best friend in a letter and what they really thought after they had time to think about it and edit it and put it into a published work.
Yeah, you can get the heat of the moment.
So it's hard because all of this comes into play, especially in this kind of history of ideas, right? As you're sort of trying to trace the evolution of somebody's thought on a particular topic, especially people that are known for having wise thoughts on particular topics.
Yeah, you think of somebody like the late Adler, and he would be the one who would represent, I'm going to try to teach you faithfully the history of ideas as they were presented by their best representatives. If you can find somebody like that in history, study under that guy.
Yeah.
I've seen this presented and was taught it actually by Simeon Zoll. The retrieval of certain theological, but this would apply for historical ideas or things, can't be used universally. So, for instance, in our chapter on the friendship between Luther and Melanchthon in Where Two or Three Are Gathered, I used letters between Melanchthon and Luther, but I quote unquote retrieve those in order to get a picture of what their friendship was like, not necessarily what a particular theological issue was right. Right. So you're retrieving that for a particular use that those documents are more in line with than, say, trying to get Luther's doctrine of justification out of those letters.
Yeah, and all I'm trying to say is that this is it's a careful task, and it's one that we've sort of in our modern conversations have lost track of how careful it is and how many factors there are that play in. Now, you can go two ways with that. You can say there's so many variables involved with studying the stuff that you really can't know much of anything at all, right? Or you can kind of get definitive and say, well, this means, of course, you can know exactly X, Y, or Z. And I think Adam, the way Adam described it, is good. And I think we more of us should think of it this way: that you do your best, right? You do your best with the data that's available to you, and you make
the fewest number of assumptions.
You make the fewest number of assumptions, and when you make an assertion, you sort of give the reason why you're making said assertion, with the understanding that it's, I wouldn't say up for debate, but I'll say it's open to further investigation on the thing.
Always is. Yeah.
And that would be so helpful in the modern theological conversation, just to know, stop thinking that just because we've made an assertion that it's definitive. I mean, that it's absolutely definitive, and that it's not up for further investigation, or that our sources need only be limited to the sources that will confirm the assertion that's already been given. And some of this is just not helpful. And this is just basic. In a lot of ways, we've done so many shows on epistemology. This is what this is. I mean, you can take this conversation and apply it to many things in life, right?
Right.
How do you know anything about this? Well, you're going to know because you've taken in information from various sources, and you've weighed those sources, and you've leaned on some, and you've discarded others. And as information piles up in one pile, you tend to believe, the thing that pile seems to be asserting.
Well, and sometimes for the sake of fruitful discourse, you have to be aware of and open about that place where you got that information and the conclusion.
There are books. I bought a whole set of them, but it was not the only one, that were designed for a freshman as to what to look for in his field. Even if he didn't have a field yet, that it might be his field. So you have these great historians, for instance, doing how to take history courses, or what to look for. For instance, I've used this one already. If I'm going to go on in historical studies, I am not going to go to a department where every representative in the department is a Marxist. I'm not going to go to that university, or I'm going to try and find a university where somebody's goal is to tell the truth. That makes sense?
Interesting implications for some things.
Well, it means just being honest. So, like, if you have a proposition that you find yourself arguing, and then somebody says, "Well, how do you know that?" And maybe it is just a gut feeling. Just maybe you lose that argument in that instance. But it's better to admit that it's a gut feeling than to sort of keep arguing it. And if it is a gut feeling, investigate it further.
Sure.
See if you're right or wrong. I mean, this is sort of
that kind of openness is at fewer and fewer and fewer American universities. But it's worth pursuing, so that all that money you're going to borrow has some value when you're done.
I was even in our own broader social circles, that's that sort of openness and willingness to change your mind.
Seeing less of it.
Yeah, it's
and
insane.
a Christian who's educated, if somebody comes up and says, "How do I know you're not just like a Marxist? You've got your Christian take on things." That's a perfect question for a Christian.
Sure is. I mean, have you read outside of your particular system? Have you considered the alternatives? Have you weighed the evidence? Have you read the critics? Have you read the people within your own tradition that believe slightly differently than you do, and weighed what their assertions against the ultimate authority, which is Scripture. I mean,
Yeah, even if you have a source and norm like Scripture, it's not opposed to those outside
Yeah.
ideas then being investigated by Scripture.
Right.
it's just that this is a lot of work.
A lot of work. Takes a lot of maturity too.
Think of the historians of the future that are going to have to cull through our Facebook posts and our Twitter feed, and our
Oh, God, no.
Instagram.
Please don't.
feed,
Oh,
and our email and our text to try to find out what we really think about something.
good grief.
When I first started doing this, when I first started working on my PhD dissertation, I was, I'd say naively, trying to argue influence, right? And one of the wisest things that was ever said to me is that an argument from influence is essentially a waste of time, right? Because you're always sort of doing this comparative analysis, trying to figure out who had what idea first, and weighing in the balance, and that it's a very difficult thing to ever come to a conclusion on, right? You can almost only ever get to the point of, well, it seems like, and
Think of C.S. Lewis when he wrote in one of his books, The Value of Psychological Arguments.
right.
And what he said and delivered to us was, none of them can be definitive. You have got to have different grounds if you're trying
Yes,
to
that's
argue
my
that something is true.
Right.
A psychological argument is not adequate. Know it from the beginning. It's not.
Yeah. So anyway, I don't know why I said that.
Well,
Anyway, I had to change. Essentially, what I'm saying is I had to
Yeah.
change to something that had better epistemological groundwork.
Yep.
Something that you could sort of rely on. And what you in history, what you land on is what the person said.
Yep.
What did they say on, especially if you're talking about the history of ideas? What did they say on said topic?
Yep.
Not what was their motive.
Yep.
Who was in their
Which-
ear telling them what to say?
Yep.
And that's
but what they actually said.
And that's what we've pointed out on past episodes. And just to relate it, because some people know what your doctorate was about, and some people don't. That's one of the reasons we've done so many episodes on Melanchthon, because a lot of Melanchthon, quote unquote scholarship has been about his motivations
And
not what he actually wrote, but why he wrote it.
Yeah.
And that's where the problems sort of get is when
And
people
who influenced him to write
Yeah.
it?
Right.
I mean, everybody from John Calvin into
Yeah. He knew everybody.
instead of analyzing the piece of writing itself.
Luther once said of historians that they're the most useful of all people because they alone tell the truth.
I've heard you say that a couple times.
I've never
But
seen
usually
you
you're
cite it.
smiling from ear to ear when
But
you say it.
one more thing, throw you a bone. Melanchthon once quoted Cicero, who said, "Those who don't know their history forever remain children."
Yep.
Yes.
I don't know why I throw that in, but
No, that's a very
since we're
useful
kind of
comment.
panning out,
It sounded like an ending quote, but I sort of have one more thing to.
That would have been great.
That would have been a good one. You can say it again. How about that? But part of this too is like your system of trust of where you get your information from too. So if somebody told me and said, Adam said that Luther was a heretic, I'd be like, I'd sit here and go, I'd look at them and say, that doesn't sound like something Adam would say. Where did he say it? Where did he?
how many beers
publish
did he
it?
have?
Yeah,
You
like
know, those
Yeah.
Get
Was
the-
it followed by a GIF in the text?
But I guess my point is I wouldn't be willing to say Adam would never say something like that. I'd be open to somebody showing me an instance where you said
Sure.
that you could have, that any one of us at this table could be wrong. And I think we've tried to do that over the years, in especially the early episodes where we gave massive we did a whole episode with a bibliography of over 150 sources, books.
And I often freely admit that I was wrong once.
Yes, that's true. And so I think the point of all of that is to encourage people to continue their education, to not just stop here. And the fact of the matter is, if you continue in reading these things that we claim to have read and are regurgitating the information out of on this show, you might email us in and say,
I think you overcalled that.
yes, and that would be, that's a fair thing to do. It's an inquiry that we are open to on this show.
Yep.
As not sort of being the end all be all authorities, but trying to have a conversation. And unfortunately with a podcast, it's a one-way conversation with people at home that encourage them to continue this this endeavor.
Yep.
And I think that's why we do so many epistemology episodes as well.
You could probably notice it when we do shows where we discuss other positions and how sort of nervous we are.
Yeah, we try to be careful.
And the caveats we give and sort of say, all right, I'm open to being corrected on this because I am. I've read a fair amount of Calvin, but I'm open to being corrected on my sort of impressions of Calvin.
Yeah, I issued a correction on Twitter, not on the show, but I overshot the gap between the publication of the Institutes and Luther's sort of beginning reforms on an episode by several years.
6 years.
Yeah, and I just wanted to be like, hey, look, I was shooting from the hip, and I made it sound like there was a larger gap than there was, or something like that. And
Good.
it's
Good illustration of it.
It's an instance where sort of like I don't think that the point I was trying to get across was misplaced, but the data I used to support that point wasn't entirely correct.
One that interests me in this field is that Calvin originally signed the Augsburg Confession.
It was very widely accepted. I just said that in my class on Sunday morning, that we attribute a lot of sort of the firestorm of Lutheranism to early Lutheran works by Luther, which is fair. But we often leave out the firestorm in favor of the Reformation to catch up in greater Europe, Western Europe, shall we say, to the publication of the Augsburg Confession and the political support of the publication of the Augsburg Confession,
Right.
and how that helped the ideas of the Reformation gain foothold, not just theologically but politically, in other portions of Europe.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, one of my favorite contemporary historians is Neil Ferguson, spelled Nile.
Okay.
He writes broadly. He's an economic historian, but he makes the point. He talks about intellectual history, the history of ideas. He says that's all well and good, but the way ideas are passed on is
I've
through
heard
institutions.
him.
And so it is, like you said, the politicians in the age or the political people
In the sort of
Reformation.
post-industrial history, economic historians are becoming more and more sort of the go-to people on the transmission of not only ideas but things, right?
Yeah,
the things that change history in particular areas.
Yeah, like the church, political institutions, and like the Diet of
Railroads.
Augsburg. That's an institution of a
Communities.
It's
I
not
mean,
just ideas floating around out there disembodied.
Yeah, you can't become a Christian sort of your own internalness. It has to be transmitted from an outsider to you, somebody who's a member of this Christian community has to relay that information to you.
Wasn't Ferguson just on that other podcast we listened to?
Jonah Goldberg's? Yeah, a while
About a month ago.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Oh, interesting. Well, hey, guys, we made it to the end of the episode. Adam, I don't know, do you want to repeat your quote? Or you want to end on a fancy...
Historians are the most useful of all people. They alone tell the truth.
There you go. We hope you enjoyed this episode. You can support the show. We need monetary donations in order to keep the show going. So you can support the show by going to 1517.org/donate. We would love to see your support, big or small. In setting up a small recurring donation is one of the easy ways that people can help us who maybe don't have the means to float the whole boat. So
How about
we
instead of a
appreciate that.
small recurring donation, an affordable?
An affordable recurring donation. I like that. That's good. That's a good way to say that. So again, and thank you for those people who currently support us. Thank you for those who support us by, helping us increase listeners, encouraging others to listen, sharing.
Hey, we
it
haven't
at their
told people to
churches.
go on and rate the show in a while.
We haven't. I forgot about it. But yeah, you can go on iTunes. That's the primary place where you can rate it. You can rate it on other avenues like Podcast Addict and some and Google Play Store and stuff too. But if you do use iTunes, it'd be helpful to go to the Thinking Fellows page on there, even if you don't use iTunes, to listen to the podcast and to rate the show. I think we have close to 400 ratings on there right now. It'd be cool to get over 500. So
We could have a party.
that would be great. We have
Adam could smoke ribs.
Yeah, we have many, many, many more than 500 listeners. So if if a good chunk of you could go rate the show, that would be very helpful.
Maybe Adam will smoke some ribs.
And maybe Adam will smoke some ribs if somehow that's relevant.
I'm a master chef.
All right.
Well, thank you for listening to this episode. We'll catch you next time.
Bye.
Bye.